Kia ora koutou, educator whānau, and welcome to the first episode of Tiny Talks for Educators. The purpose behind this wee new podcast / webinar for educators is to help you work through every aspect of your role as an educator, from your business management through to curriculum delivery, through to communication with whānau and families, and of course, understanding the broader education landscape that we're operating in. So these educator tiny talks will only be 10 to 15 minutes long each. They'll each focus on a key topic that we want to dig deep and explore more with you. And it makes sense to now focus first on our macro environment and how we're operating as Tiny Nation, a home-based early learning provider. And more than that, how we're operating as a home-based service, trying to expand our reach, increase demand for home-based, increase recognition for home-based, and of course share all the benefits that home-based offers. Let's start at the top. The first session for us is all about the ECE landscape, the education reform and the change that we're currently working through in the early childhood sector. Because we are in a really unique situation at the moment where government have come in and made no secret about the fact that they want to reform education and that they want to look at where their government spend is best spent, what offers the most benefits, and how they can make it easier for educators to offer high quality early learning experiences for children and their whānau. We know that we're one part of a broader sector subtype in terms of being able to offer our services and being uniquely placed to showcase the benefits of home-based to families, you know, the small groups, low ratio care, and the ability to have those one-on-one attachment relationships and really inform the developing brain and everything that happens foundationally for those children in these nurturing, familiar home environments. So as you all know, Tiny Nation are huge advocates for home-based. We're all mums ourselves who have gone through this model of care, which is why it's so close to our hearts and why we believe so strongly in making sure that home-based is supported and funded well into the future and continues to grow as more and more people know about the benefits and can access them. So I'm just going to really briefly take you through what's happening in the regulatory environment at the moment. We know there's a lot of stuff flying around across the whole education spectrum. We know that it's a big work program for the current government. And we know that early childhood education obviously is the start of that. It's where the foundations are laid. And we do have a government that's come in and very strongly indicated that change is on the way. So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the big things that are happening at the moment. The first is the regulatory review. And some of you might remember that last year we went through a regulatory review for the whole early childhood education sector that was designed to try and help understand the rules and regulations that we operate by and how we can maybe simplify them a little bit more or make them more flexible to allow for providers to offer sustainable, high quality care that is more affordable and accessible to families and isn't necessarily duplicated or layered, which it currently is when you look at the regulations and licensing criteria that we have to abide by. So we went through that process. We submitted a whole lot of feedback that basically said, look, we're all for quality. We're all for making sure that every child and family feels safe and secure in their early learning journey. But we can make this more efficient. We can make it more effective and more innovative. And we can actually challenge some of the practices that we have just because it's a box ticking exercise. So we went through that process and kind of talked about where we saw overlap in the regulatory framework. And since then, the government have come out with some proposed new licensing criteria, which is the criteria that providers use on a day-to-day basis to inform the delivery of their service. So as educators, you are obviously meeting these licensing criteria every day in your homes. It spans from health and safety, premises and facilities, curriculum, right through to governance and management. So the job that we do as providers to uphold that regulatory framework and make sure that our educators and our whānau and communities are well supported. So they've come out with a consultation around reviewing that licensing criteria. And that consultation has been and gone. We've been really invested in having a say on because we know how important it is on a day-to-day basis for our educators to feel supported by this criteria and the regulatory framework. We're going to see as a result of this, I think, is we're going to see far less duplication across the licensing criteria document We're also going to see some unnecessary things kind of slip away that were more just administrational compliance box ticking things and didn't actually contribute to the quality of service that's being provided. So we're in favour of most of these things. Some of the things that we're going to see change specifically for home-based is that we're going to see more flexibility around how you can operate in terms of sharing information with families. We're going to see more digitalisation of forms, which we've been long advocating for. So things like accidents, illnesses, parent permissions for excursions, and all of the day-to-day forms that you use as educators will now be a lot more digital. And that word has crept in a lot in terms of the documentation required. So no longer is it just written documentation, but digital documentation, which is really exciting. We're also going to see a little bit less administration just for the sake of administration, which is great, and a little bit more focus on the child and on the curriculum and on actually being with, as opposed to recording things that aren't necessarily needed to be recorded. And just a little bit more common sense. So, for example, instead of having to do your emergency drills every 3 months, you can now do it every term, which is, makes sense in terms of how educators structure their years and fits in with, obviously, before and after school children attending and other things like that. Just a bit more of a common sense approach. We are excited to be involved in that consultation, and we have released that as a part of a wider provider group and shared that with our educator base so that you can see what we think and why we think it. So if you're a Tiny Nation educator, you'll see that pinned up on our Tiny Nation Facebook page exclusively for educators so that you can follow through on all of the work we're doing at that level. We're hoping that we're going to hear back shortly around where that all lands, because the intention was that new licensing criteria was going to be gazetted in September or October of this year. So it is quite a quick turnaround time. That work is being done as a bigger subset of a funding review that is happening at the moment, where a funding review panel has been appointed that will oversee the whole of the early childhood education sector in terms of looking at the way that services are funded, what works, what doesn't. It will be the biggest reform of funding that we've seen in our generation, and that is because everything is on the table in terms of being able to unpick what's happening. And for home-based, really overdue. We have been marginalised in terms of funding for a long time, and we believe that we can make a really positive impact here in terms of what could be passed through both to educators and families to support the cost of early childhood education if we were only funded at a comparable rate to our centre-based counterparts. So that is a big focus for us over the next 6 to 12 months. It's likely going to land in terms of recommendations from that funding panel this time next year. So it is an ongoing piece of work and something that's very much happening in the background. The other big thing that you might have seen recently that has been announced in the news is that there is an intention for the Education Review Office to take over the regulatory management function of early childhood education. So up until this point, the Ministry of Education have held that responsibility. The Minister has indicated that he is looking to pass legislation to transfer that responsibility over to the Education Review Office. So the Ministry of Education will continue to act in a support guidance capacity and manage the curriculum aspects of delivery for early learning services. But ERO, or the Education Review Office, will actually pick up that regulatory obligation, and there will be a Director of Regulation who will be addressing any concerns or complaints that come through with regard to regulation. So the intention of this is to reduce the overlap. If you've been an educator for a long time, you'll probably know, because you would have been suspect to visits from both the Ministry of Education and ERO, which often focus on the same things. And there's been a real overlap for a long time around the health and safety and premises and facilities checks that both of those governing bodies have kind of played in. So this is another result of the regulatory review and trying to unpick that overlap where possible and make it really clear who's responsible for what when it comes to how the Ministry of Education and the Education Review Office work together. Still waiting for a little bit more detail. It was only announced last week, but it is the latest in a string of different education reforms for early childhood education that are really going to make a big difference to the way that we as providers and you as educators operate on a day-to-day basis. So that's a little bit of the ECE landscape in a nutshell. It's a very, very quick whirlwind tour of what's currently happening in that space. As you know, Tiny Nation is has positioned itself as a real thought leader in early childhood education in terms of what's happening in the space for home-based. We lead a broader provider group so that we can be representative of the sector. But first and foremost, we're representative of our educators and of our families and of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. And we make it our mission to make sure that you feel empowered and supported to continue that mahi. So what is happening in that macro environment is very, very important to us, and it's something that we always want to have a strong voice on and influence where we can, because we know that is the future of home-based and the future of the work that we do for generations to come. So that is a wee summary of the ECE landscape. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen in, and I'll join you again soon for the next instalment of Educated Tiny Talks. Ka kite.